click this. I click that.
Right.
Okay.
Do you want to switch over?
Okay. I
Do you want to
guess.
look at this or just
This is fine.
this is fine?
It's fine.
And this as well?
Okay, maybe I should.
Okay. So let's get started then. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this December webinar. My name is Sim Chong. I'm the convener of the Research Synthesis and Applied Linguistics SIG at the British Association for Applied Linguistics. This is our December webinar. And this year, if you attended our first event, in the first half of the year, you'll remember Vahid is actually our speaker, giving us an introduction about scientometric and bibliometric review. And today we have Vahid again, together with his colleague Azrifa, to give us a more in-depth, practical, kind of hands-on workshop-style webinar on scientometric and bibliometric review. So I'm going to hand over to Vahid and Azrifa, and they will begin the talk, and we'll have 10 to 15 minutes at the very end for questions and answers. But for now, I will hand over to the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, for the kind introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Vahid, and together with Azrifa in my office, we're presenting this talk. Actually, most of the presentation is going to be done by Azrifa. We decided to come over to my office because the internet has not been stable these days, and it seems that I have a slightly more stable internet connection today. So our presentation is about evaluation of research impact in applied linguistics with focus on the uses and pitfalls of citation counts and co-citation analysis. So I'm going to pass the time to Azrifa, pass the floor to her for her presentation.
Thanks, Vahid. Okay, so I think I would like to start off with a really nice big number here that we can see, 160,000 over publications. This is the number of publications that, according to Scopus Search, if you put in the keywords applied and linguistics, and that gave an even bigger number than this. And then when you limit it to social sciences and arts and humanities, this is basically the huge number of publications so far that we have. So given this huge number, how can anybody can really go through this many publications, right? So this is what we want to talk about today. As we can see here that the same number, the distribution of the publications in this graph here, we can see that it has really shot up from 2007 and it's ever increasing. So we really need to find ways to make sense of this amount of research, and which is probably why the number of review studies overall have gone up along with the number of publications overall. So these are several types of review studies that have been done. Narrative reviews are based on experts' intuitive, experiential, and explicit perspectives in focused topics. And of course, this has its pluses, but the major minus is that they tend to be quite subjective. And the selection of the research that is being reviewed is dependent on these experts' intuition. So then we also have systematic reviews, which requires the selection of data according to a pre-specified criteria to address specific RQs. So quantitative tools can be used to do meta-analysis, for example, and clustering. So related also is the idea of a scoping review, where the literature is selected to answer a particular research question. And then finally, the topic of our talk today is the scientometrics reviews, which measure and analyze extensive literature. And this is the key part of scientometric analysis, that we can really harness big data and to be able to identify patterns within that. And we use both a combination of primarily quantitative, but also some sort of qualitative analysis to understand that data, and largely also to use computational approaches in order to analyze the networks. So this is an overview of what we'll be talking about. We'll be analyzing, we're going through how citation data can be analyzed using cytometrics and what it actually is, and how the research networks may be formed and evaluated. So in the second section, we'll be going through what kind of metrics that are produced about these networks and what do they show about the research networks. Then we'll also look at how to interpret some of the clusters using our previous research has been published. So what do these networks actually show about the field? And then finally, we want to end off with a bit of a discussion about the limitations and how citations may not actually be a complete measure of research impact. So to start off, I think the essential question is, what is this mysterious cytometrics, right? So for those who have attended by his previous talk, obviously this is not a mystery, but just for completeness, is the idea that we can look at citation data and analyze it quantitatively, and is part of a larger field of study, bibliometrics, which studies documents and measurements of various metrics. And one of the key things that, or key methods, is the quantitative approach to analyzing publications. So cytometrics focuses on science itself and how science can be mapped using relational bibliometrics to map these connections between the different streams of work within a huge field, for example. So there are three main different types of cytometric analyses. There are a few more, but these are the main types: the document co-citation analysis, author co-citation analysis, and journal co-citation analysis. But at the core of it is the idea of the co-citation method, where we have citing documents here that can be clustered together based on what they cite, and using computational methods also map out how these cited documents are related to each other. Here are some tools that can be used. We have used mostly CiteSpace, but as we can see here, there are a couple of other options and each have their own affordances. CiteSpace and bibliometrics can be used to do document co-citation analysis, author co-citation analysis, and journal co-citation analysis, as well as to map out networks within the field. And these are also visualized in various ways. Voice Viewer has a bit more limited affordance, while quite interestingly, although we have not used it, is Citu, which has co-authorship networks. Okay, so this is the interface of CiteSpace. And if you were to do your own co-citation analysis, this is where we would determine the type of co-citation analysis by selecting the node types. So there are some major advantages of co-citation analysis. Mainly, we can harness large bibliographic data sets and perform quantitative analysis, which is more objective than the qualitative narrative review types of reviews. And this is an example of visualization that is produced by CiteSpace. And we can see here quite clearly that it really maps out the different topic of interest in the particular field. And here, I know this is really tiny, but basically this maps it out over years. And this is a very useful sort of handy way to, at one glance, see what the field is like. In addition to that, co-citation analysis also allows for text mining to be able to produce automatically generated labels that can give you more information about the clusters. So what is a co-citation cluster? Clustering is to identify prominent groupings, and in this case, prominent groupings of publications. And a cluster is based on a hierarchy of key terms in the articles that cite the cluster. And the prominent members of the cluster are can be regarded as intellectual milestones in the evolution of the field, while recurring themes in the citing articles reflect the interrelationship between the intellectual base and research fronts. So we'll talk about this a bit more in depth in the next few minutes, but basically both these research fronts and the intellectual bases provide insights to how the special the field is and the intellectual milestones that has led to the field being in the state that it is. So what is an intellectual base? It's basically the core set of articles or authors or concepts that have been widely cited by researchers in the field. And it represents the central ideas, theories, and methods that are usually taught in undergraduate courses, for example. So it's quite easy to identify them when you see them in the cluster. But more interesting also is how the different research fronts actually develop. So these are for the moment, the cutting edge and emerging topics in a research domain. Do we want to mute the mic? It's
now.
Okay, great. So these are identified by classes of more research articles, authors, or concepts that show a high level of co-citation with each other, but are not actually as connected to this established intellectual base. And it can represent new directions and potential breakthroughs in the field, which is useful if you want to identify future research opportunities and trends. So just to see what research networks are and what kind of metrics can we use to evaluate these networks. Here is an example of the research network of the field of applied linguistics from 1970 to 2022, and this is from our publication. And we'll go through this and the following tables that we also extracted from our publication. So this is the kind of output that can be seen, that you can have from any cytometric analysis. So you can identify the major clusters and the labels, and drilling down, we can also see the publications with the strongest burst here in cluster 0, but of course you will see it for other clusters as well. So in order to identify which are the important citing and cited publications, there are several metrics to determine all this. They can be divided to the temporal metrics and structural metrics. Basically, so we have key metrics here are citation burstness, which shows the sudden increases in citation count, and the sigma value, which indicates scientific novelty. The silhouette score modularity Q and betweenness centrality shows how well the network is formed. So each showing different things. Silhouette scores shows is a measure of clustering accuracy. Modularity Q measures clustering quality, while betweenness centrality is the degree to which one node, a publication, is situated between all the other different publications.
If I may add a point here, Azrifa, about citation burstness. This is sometimes confused with the number of citation counts. They're different in the sense that citation burstness refers to a publication which starts to receive a large number of citations over a short period of time. So it suddenly starts to attract a lot of attention from the different groups of people in that field. And you can also measure whether this burstness persists for a long time or it just dwindles and disappears after a period of time. So that's the difference between burstness and citation counts. I just wanted to add that in.
Okay, so the silhouette score is a measure of cohesion, the tightness of the nodes within a cluster, and its separation between them as well. So it indicates homogeneity or accuracy in clustering, but we have to take this with a bit of caution because a perfect silhouette score can be deceptive and can show that perhaps the citing articles, there's only one small core of citing articles that's contributing to that silhouette score. And one node clusters can really form with high silhouette scores.
Just also to add on to what Ezra mentioned about tightness of nodes within a cluster and separation. And as you see, there are two clusters here, one on the left-hand side and the other one on the right-hand side. The one in the left-hand side consists of three components. Each of them actually represent one publication. They are related to each other, and how closely they are related to each other is also it can be measured by using an index which is called tightness. It also goes by the word cohesion. So if your cluster has tightness, those publications that appear in a cluster have a lot in common with each other. And by a lot in common, I basically mean that they have co-cited a lot of papers together. That's the cohesion or tightness of clusters on their own. But there's also the idea of separation. These clusters should also be beautifully separated from each other and not be overlapping with each other. So if we put together these statistics, that's the cohesion index as well as the separation index, we can create a new index which is called the silhouette index, as Rifa said. And it's important because in scientometric analysis or in co-citation analysis, it indicates whether we have nicely formed clusters and whether they are cohesive within their own structure and well differentiated from other clusters.
Okay, cool. So to use real life data, this is the results that we got from our analysis. And as we can see here, we have quite high silhouette scores, which can be reflective of a high precision in clustering. So scores that tend towards 0 might suggest that the publications belong to two clusters, while anything in negative would reflect some error in clustering, and you might want to relook your data. Okay, so another metric is the modularity Q, which is a measure of the clustering quality of how well structured the overall network is. So you saw this image from earlier, and our value is not very high, but it's not bad either. So modularity Q of 0.4765. So we don't really want a very, very high score either, right, towards 1, because it may indicate that there are outlier cases where documents are isolated. So values between 0.3 and 1 shows that the network is clearly divided into distinct groups, while 0 to 0.3 shows that there might be many between cluster links.
Yeah, and this is the same if you're asking whether it's the same as the modularity Q or the Q index in clustering analysis. Yes, it's exactly the same thing. It's also used in social networks analysis, if I'm not wrong, but I'm pretty sure about its application in clustering analysis.
And so finally, we also have betweener centrality, which measures the importance of a node or the publication in the network. And a high betweener centrality tends to indicate connections to other clusters. So it might be an indication of a high impact or potentially revolutionary publication. But so in our example, in our study, we found the betweener centrality values were not very high, but this can be attributed to the fact that we use such a large data set, and it kind of like dilutes it slightly. So you really have to look at your data set itself and the scope of what you're trying to achieve. And it's not an absolute thing that you have to look at the different metrics together. And speaking of together, one of the key metrics that we look at is the actual publication that Vahid has explained quite nicely just now about the burstness, and that it measures the rate of change rather than the absolute citation counts itself. And it ranges from 0 to infinity. And the higher values indicate greater increases in citation count of the publication. And CiteSpace also there's this lovely bit of visualization where warm colors reflects more recent bursts and cool colors reflects older bursts. So it's a nice way to be able to see visually what kinds of where this kind of clusters and how recent they are.
I also would like to add about another point about bursts here. As you can see, Chomsky's work, for example, is a burst with the highest statistic there, followed by Selinker and other scholars. One interesting finding from this table is that almost all, without any exception, actually, all of these studies were published before 1990, which means that it probably takes some time for every research project which is published in a journal paper to become a burst in its own field. Another point to consider is the fact that, as Rifa also mentioned, the centralities are small, the centrality statistics. In other fields, if you look at, for example, Chao-Mei Chen's work, Chao-Mei Chen is the developer of site space. They usually get larger bursts and centrality. And if they're doing an analysis on, for example, the work of Nobel Prize winners, the burst and centrality index is much higher than this. It just indicates that other fields beyond applied linguistics might be more coherently related to each other. And maybe in applied linguistics, we still do not have that high level of connection.
So other values that we can also look at is the sigma value, which is a composite metric that is defined in site space to measure the combined strength of the structural and temporal properties. So between the centrality that we've seen earlier as well as the citation burst. And this might be an indicator of novelty, where larger values indicate novelty of the field. And if you're interested in finding new research fronts, this can perhaps be one of the metrics that you can use to identify such publications and areas of interest. So moving on, how do we then interpret the clusters themselves? We see a lot of numbers, but what do the networks actually show about the field itself? So again, based on what we have done, we found that actually cluster 0 that you saw earlier with Chomsky and Selinker and Kreshad and all these big names in applied linguistics actually form the intellectual base of applied linguistics itself. And as Vahid has rightly pointed out, it took quite some time for this base to form. So you can't expect to find a lot of early publications in this kind of clusters. And then we also found that there were some brief significant concerns over the years. So for this, we can actually look to the half-life and start date and end dates and see how this kind of clusters actually, how long this were of a topic of interest, basically. So to identify research fronts, having identified the intellectual base, we can also look at the other different clusters. The mean year obviously might be one indicator, where if it's slightly later, it's less likely to be the the intellectual base. Here, knowing what we know of the publications here, we can kind of see that there's a move towards language in use, a kind of the perspective of language in use with Swallows and Highland and Facklow, for example. And this is where knowledge of the field, as well as qualitative analysis, reading all these materials, if you are not aware of them already, actually can combine to be able to, for us to be able to interpret the numbers.
Yeah, just one more point here, as Rifa just mentioned. Cluster 0 is the oldest cluster because its mean index, as you can see from the table, is 1978. Whereas the youngest cluster, based on the mean year of publication, is cluster number 4, right?
2 and 4.
2 and 4. Yeah, they're both 2005. So number cluster number 2 is primarily focused on syntactic complexity based on the data mining algorithm that was used in Citation. And the fourth cluster is about motivational self-system, again, based on the same algorithm that we used. Of course, you can rename these labels because they have been automatically generated. If you don't feel like this is the right name for this cluster, it will take more time. Of course, you have to manually go through the publications and the key terms that and key ideas that were used in those publications to decide whether this label is well suited for this cluster or not.
Which is actually a very good point, because cluster 1 here is supposed to be contrastive rhetoric, but we kind of decided that it was more reflective of that kind of language in use theories that are around. So that's a very good example of how the data mining labels might not be 100% accurate. Okay, so we can also identify research fronts from a diachronic perspective. So we can see here from the mean years, what Vahid had gone through just now, actually, some of the clusters forming kind of a distinct grouping in terms of chronology. So 1970 to 2000s, 1990 to the present state, and 2000 to the current moment, with some overlaps, obviously, and these are not absolute cut-off dates. As well as the cited documents themselves, citing publications can also be indicative of the structure of the network or what the field is like. So most citing publications in cluster 2 investigate syntactic complexity. So we went through each of these citing publication, and by sheer luck, or well, some accuracy of the data mining, the label is actually quite spot on here. So having seen that, I think Vahid has sort of hinted at some of the limitations of using citation counts as a measure of research impact. But I want to bring back actually to why citation indexes were even formed. So Eugene Garfield, who actually started this whole idea of citation, started it thinking that it's for eliminating the uncritical citation of fraudulent, incomplete, and obsolete data by making it possible for the conscientious scholar to be aware of criticisms of earlier papers. So what he actually intended was for people to engage with citations rather than to count it per se, and to actually be able to trace the ideas that has been published and things like that. So that actually brings us to the limitations of co-citation analysis. Because we are looking at data at a massive scale, information will be lost. And this information, unfortunately, tends to be the context of use. So you don't really know whether people are citing these publications because they agree with the authors or they disagree, for example. So it privileges the quantity of citations, or so controversial ideas which may eventually prove to be wrong can have very high citation counts. And in a way, they have quite a huge impact, but it's not necessarily that it's correct. The other thing is that, of course, we all know how people behave. The citation bias. Citation practices are influenced by things like journal prestige, author reputation, language barriers, and the last one especially is very concerning for equity. But I mean, we are also guilty of that. So in like our paper, we actually restricted our analysis to only quartile 1 journals because it was such a massive undertaking. And of course, we acknowledge that this is a limitation, that this, we have deliberately at the outset taken on journal prestige as a metric in order to select our journal articles. So we have to just be aware of that. And Vahid has also mentioned earlier about time lag. You need a kind of critical period in order for citations to pick up and in order to see whether that idea actually, are really significant to the field. And of course, you have neglect of non-cited literatures, like theses and this kind of gray literature. But also when something is highly established and has become something like a law, and people don't cite it anymore because you can just refer to, say, Halliday's theory of systemic function linguistics, and you don't actually have to cite it because a lot of people in the field know it. So the data doesn't quite capture this kind of citation behaviors, and that can be one of the limitations of closed citation analysis.
I just wanted to add one more point, Azrifa, here about citation bias. I think this is an area that is critically under-researched in applied linguistics. We do have bibliometrics research and scientometric studies published in different journals, which address different fields or subfields within the community of applied linguistics. But I'm not sure if we have done much of those studies that focus on citation bias and investigated. In a different project, one of my students is basically investigating these causes of citation bias, and she has identified quite a large number of factors which are, in a sense, not scientific, but they can significantly predict the number of citations of papers. In a regression analysis she conducted, she found that, if I'm not wrong, something around 24% of the variance that is observed in citation counts can be explained by those non-scientific factors, which just indicates that relying excessively on citations or even the co-citations may not be necessarily the best practice in the field. So we're kind of criticizing our own work from this perspective.
Do you want to do the conclusions?
I didn't go ahead, please.
Okay. So just to iterate, scientometric analysis can be really useful when you are confronted with a lot of data and a lot of research and you don't know where to start. I personally use it when I'm trying to find kind of the scope of my own thesis, for example, is what I'm doing now. And what are kind of like the major thoughts or significant authors that have influenced this particular area. So it's not particular to just a field. It can also be used for a subfield or a specific topic that you're looking at, as long as you have sufficient data to form the clustering. So I attempted to do this with a different field in history, and because it was such a small data set, we actually couldn't form a proper cluster at all. So there is such thing as too little data. So I think one of the things that we want to be able to identify, so have sufficient data to identify patterns in the field so that we can cluster the networks and identify these networks. So by identifying and evaluating these research clusters, we need to know all these metrics that we have gone through. And these metrics can be used to evaluate the analysis of itself, the scientometric analysis that we have seen, and also to identify the publications that have made an impact to the field. So in terms of use, I guess if you want to use it for your own research, metrics to identify publications that have made an impact to the field would be of more relevance to you. And finally, we just have to take the analysis with a bit of a pinch of salt, and that citations are not a determinant of quality of research, but I think all the researchers here are very well aware of this fact and of confounding variables, like the context of citation that we mentioned, the time lag, and of course the Matthew effect, where more established authors tend to be cited more. So we've actually looked at various different aspects of applied linguistics using scientometric. So our publication, the one that we have presented here, was looking at the field in general, but Vahid has also looked at certain trends in subfields, which was what I mentioned earlier, that you can also look at specific areas. So here they looked at computer-assisted language learning and eye tracking. I quite like this article a lot, and a review of comprehension subskills, as well as research about language assessment and SLA in general. So Vahid has a lot of videos, 5, 6, on how to conduct psychometric analysis, step-by-step guide. And this was what I actually learned of. So we put a QR code to the first one, and feel free to watch the videos. Yeah, so I think we have finished, unless you have anything to add.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. I think that's the end of our presentation.
Any questions, perhaps?
Thank you very much, Asrifa and Vahid, for the presentation. In particular, I know it's already past 6 p.m. way over working hours in Singapore, so really appreciate that. It's very informative, very rich, and I think it's such a nice continuation of Vahid's talk earlier in the year. So I would strongly encourage people to check out that recording that I just shared in the chat with the slides available as well. Are there any questions from the audience? You can either raise your hand, I will call your name, or you can type your questions or comments in the chat. Paul, please go ahead.
Hello, that was very interesting, thank you. I have a couple of methodological questions about co-citation, author co-citation research. I work on vocabulary acquisition in second languages, and my data sets are quite small compared to what you're working with. But I've run up against 3 problems which I'm not quite sure how to handle, and I wonder if you could offer some advice on this. One is that when I get to the more recent data, the co-citation patterns are totally dominated by one author. So that when I run my cluster analyses, everything turns out into a single cluster, which I find it difficult to differentiate. Have you run up against that problem? And if so, how do you solve it? That's my first question. The second question is that I've got a lot of historical data. I'd like to do something on the way clusters change across time, but the problem is that the clusters themselves are not stable on a year-by-year basis. So, for example, I can't take work on dictionary use in 1982 and compare it with dictionary use in 1984 or 1996, because the membership of the clusters is different and it's unstable. And the third problem I've got is quite a lot of papers appear multiple times. Sometimes they appear twice in the same year, and sometimes they appear in one year and then in the next year. Do you include things like that which appear twice, or do you just treat them as separate publications? Sorry to land these things on you.
I think we can go for it.
Okay, so thank you for the question, Paul. The questions, three questions. Very good questions, and I should say challenging. And so I'll just share my thoughts, and Asrifa can feel free to add on to what I say. The first question you asked was about recent data or recent clusters that emerge are being dominated by one particular author, right? Well, from a statistical perspective, it's not necessarily a problem, really. It just indicates that this person, if you're referring to this person being a burst in co-citation analysis, it just indicates that this person has attracted a large number of citations over a short period of time. Now, if you're using cite space, there are some configurations that you can make and you can change, which allows you to get more bursts. So I'm very happy to send you an email later. I mean, I don't have cite space on my computer now, but you can change the duration of bursts. There are a few parameters that you can change within cite space. So that particular burst that you're referring to will not dominate or will not overshadow the rest of the bursts in in the cluster, so you can allow other bursts to also appear by changing those parameters.
Just to add to that, the time frame that you use can also be adjusted so that you can see over. I think when we have the, I think we have that. So oh dear, never mind. Anyway, so at the top they have year that you are looking at. You can change those parameters for the years and just tweak around with that to see. Sometimes the clustering works when you expand or kind of look at smaller time slices. Yeah.
Can I give you a specific example then? If I look at the 2020 data for vocabulary acquisition research, it's about 400 papers. And 375 of those will cite pollination, which is a huge proportion. Now, that means when I look at the author co-citations from those 375 papers, everything goes back to pollination, and it's very difficult to get a proper cluster. I know from having read these papers that there are various different things going on, but because everybody cites pollination, you lose the finer cluster analysis.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Well, I'm not sure if there is a way to, for example, to pluck out one particular publication and see how how the cluster will get change. Because the issue is, Paul, the issue is that particular paper, for example, pollination in this example, has been co-cited across many papers. So that paper exists in the references section of all the papers. So you cannot remove it. That's the issue. So I think I understand that you see that as a problem, right?
Yes.
And do you mind elaborating what bothers you really about that?
Well, there's the philosophical question, of course, about whether a field should be dominated by a single person to this extent, but that's a separate question.
Right.
What I want to do with this data is to tease out the clusters, but because pollination is co-cited with everybody else in the system, what I get is one very large cluster rather than a lot of separate clusters. Now, I can take pollination out and analyze what's left over afterwards, a sort of a donut approach, but that seems to be intellectually dishonest.
Right. If you can do that, I think the cluster may just crumble, because if especially pollination's publication has got a very high centrality index, it means it's functioning as a glue to the cluster. So if you take away the glue, the cluster may just crumble into very small clusters.
No, that doesn't happen. You do get small. You can take it out, obviously.
Okay.
And if you do that, you get quite a reasonable pattern, the sort of pattern you'd expect to get with 7 or 8 clusters in the field, which makes sense intellectually.
That's nice. So have you looked at the other indices, like silhouette indexes of those
not
smaller clusters?
No.
Okay.
No, I haven't.
So,
that's a new idea for me.
Yeah, so I think it would be useful to look at the silhouette indices of those smaller clusters to see if they make sense or not. If the silhouette index is too small, maybe the clusters are not still strong enough to be independent from other clusters in the bigger cluster. You also mentioned an interesting point, the philosophical question, if I may quickly address that. Yeah, that's really important in social sciences, and has been observed quite a lot in scientometric research. There are publications that are being cited forever. For example, publication that was that appeared in the 1960s and 1970s they keep being cited by authors in the future, whereas you can't see this in so-called STEM fields. I don't know what that really indicates about our field, but it seems that some ideas are never retired. You know, they're always used in the field, and they make a significant contribution to future research. Yeah, that's really a philosophical question. Do you have anything else to add? No.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the question and the response. Nicholas, go ahead, please.
You're muted.
You're on.
Sorry, yeah. Sorry, thanks for a great talk. Can I just ask, does the software, the citation software, distinguish between passing references and discussed at depth references, citations? Do you see what I mean? That between references just appear in a long list of many other references and those which are discussed in some depth in the paper?
I don't think they do that automatically. So what we have actually done was to read the citing articles and look at the references themselves and to see. So that's a very good point also, because sometimes people mention certain ideas, but they don't actually use that idea much. It's just like in the literature review. So this is where it's important to actually also look at the citing articles. So what I tend to do is to actually look at the citing articles that has the highest number of cited articles. So that means we can see how much that particular publication influenced the rest of the networks. But there's an element of having to read through all that as well.
Okay, thank you.
I guess so.
All right. Any other questions? I think Paul has another question in the chat. Could I call? Oh, yeah.
No,
so that's
that was meant to be a private.
Yeah. Sorry. yeah. All right. Right. Vahid, and obviously there are audience here who have used the software and they have specific questions. And I think I'll be asking a question for those who are thinking about it and they kind of, haven't done it before. So I wonder, and it's very, very kind of specialized set of skills. I wonder what's a good starting point for them. You mentioned some videos that you recorded on YouTube. I'm sure that's like a good place to start. But I wonder if there are like, I don't know, textbooks or primers that people can refer to, especially first timers. They want to try to learn how to do it, or any exemplars that you can share for colleagues who may be interested in this kind of research.
Okay, at the risk of sounding like we're tooting our own horn, the article that we actually presented here is organized as a step-by-step, which you can apply to your own research. I personally found the Site-Space Manual quite useful, and a lot of the body of work by Chao-Mei Chen was also very useful. Although it's a lot of it is talking about other fields, the things that he writes about can be applied to using it for our own areas of research. So
we're also thinking about.
But not finished yet.
Yeah.
Oh, you can say it.
Well, this, I don't know. We have been thinking about writing a book on this, on scientometrics, and actually we have already finished the proposal, or have started.
We finished.
Yeah, we finished the proposal. We haven't finalized it, but we're planning to submit the proposal, and if it's accepted, then hopefully in some time in the future, our book will also be available.
Yes, and if anybody has any particular burning questions that you would like to see in an introduction, now's the time to tell us so we can include it.
That's great. Yeah, I think that there should be a plug for this somewhere in the talk. That will be very useful, I'm sure. Asrifa, I'm particularly interested in your experience because I noticed in the audience there are some PhD students there. And I think some of them are interested in doing it. So from your experience, how did you get started with this, and what helped you in the process? Obviously, you're going to say Vahid, but I mean, like more specifically, like how did you pick up on this very kind of specific skill set, and how is it useful for your PhD process?
So I did this the first scientometric study during my master's, and Vahid wrote me in. That was very good. But I really saw the value of how I'm able to make sense of the field, because sometimes you only get what your professors tell you, like the reading lists from your professors, and this is what they present to you, which is of course been pre-selected, and it's nice to be able to see outside of that selection what kinds of different thoughts that might have come with respect to your field. And when I started on my PhD, I think I was kind of overwhelmed because I'm doing research on language assessment for reading, and that is such a huge field, just trying to make sense of what the theories are, what things like that. So even though I don't publish these kind of things, just using the methods was helpful for me to write my literature review and to see what kinds of areas that may potentially be of interest to the field in the future also.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. I think that's very helpful, and also I think it's good for people who are here who are thinking about dipping in. Let me just make sure there are no more. Oh, there. Yeah. So there is a question in the chat from Hua Wei, I think. So thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question. Some sets that scientometric analysis gives only descriptive and general findings, but might not be able to offer insightful findings compared to other types of review. How to respond to this doubt?
So this,
Wow.
okay.
Okay, I'm not quite sure what you mean by insightful findings. Obviously, if you're just going to take the metrics and identify it based on the quantitative data alone, it's not going to be super informative. That's why I think I also emphasize that we need to read the citing papers. We need to see how the connections are formed, and that's kind of marrying the best of both worlds. We have a bit of the narrative review, but the narrative review is driven by data. So I find that more powerful and more insightful than personally than other types of review, because you have a basis for saying this is important, but then how it's important, you need to find those insights yourself. I mean, it's not gonna get rid of when we don't need to read the papers. We need to read the papers, but which papers do we read? I think that's helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. I think a twist to this question is because, there are various types of review that the two of you mentioned at the very beginning. I wonder how will you suggest people who are looking at multiple types of review and the sequence of doing multiple types of review on the same topic? Is it good to start with a scientometric review before conducting a more in-depth systematic review, or how would you recommend like a series in the sequence of reviews?
Yeah, so scientometrics review is very suitable for very, very large samples. If you have a small sample, I mean, scientometrics can still be useful, but obviously the results that you will get may not be as reliable as if your data were larger. So that's one consideration when you're doing scientometrics analysis. But if you have a smaller sample and if you have a very specific research question, for example, the effect of X on Y, just two very specific variables, like the paper that we just published a few days ago in System, where we investigated the effect of videos in in listening assessments, that's not a question suitable for scientometric analysis. because obviously you want to measure the effect of X on Y. So meta-analysis is naturally the way to go under those circumstances. So what I'm trying to say here is it really depends on the research question. I might be wrong, but I don't necessarily see a hierarchy of these different approaches to review papers or review publications. For example, if you want to meta-analyze the reliability of some tests that have been published previously, then reliability generalization analysis, which is a type of meta-analysis, would be the most suitable one, and obviously not scientometrics. So the purposes are different, and it all boils down to the research question that we have in mind. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very good. And also, I think it depends on the field itself and whether you're looking at a very small subfield. So one of my failed attempts was looking in a particular area in history, for example. And number one, there wasn't a lot of data that can be found, as in terms of the citation data. So those are the kinds of limitations that might also determine what kind of analysis you do.
All right, thank you very much. That's very useful. Any other questions from the audience? All right, thank you very much again, Vahid and Azrifa, for a very useful presentation. And I think you answer a lot of my questions, and certainly questions from the floor as well. And also thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in, especially I know some people based in the UK, it's very early. It's early in the morning, but thank you very much for joining in. If you're interested in other types of research synthesis and applied linguistics, do let us know, because every year we have a fixed theme. So for example, this year it's our first year as a SIG, and we have opted for a type that is, you know, kind of more emergent in applied linguistics, and we have 2 events based on the same review. Next year we're going to pick another type of review. So if you're interested in a particular type, do let us know. And if you know speakers, if you know people who are good at it and experienced in it, would also be very happy to hear from you. All right, so thank you very much, everybody, and I hope you have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
It was a great
Thank
day.
you. Cheers.
Paul, feel free to write to us if you want to continue the
Thank
chat.
you.
Sure.
Do you have an email address?
Oh, they stopped sharing.
Oh, yeah, stop sharing this.
Let me just reshare that.
Sharing.
Okay, I think that's on the screen, I hope.
Right, I got that. Yes,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, yes, I've got a lot of niggling practical questions I need to talk to somebody about, and I don't know many people locally who work on this sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. We'll be happy to have a chat with you about it.
For example, one of the problems I've got is on my co-citation analyses, I try and log all the publications that are available for a particular time period. But the problem with that is that lots of them are absolutely rubbish. And the question then is, do you actually want to include these low grade papers in your data sets? Because one of the things that happens is that the low grade papers all tend to cite the same people anyway. And the really critical cutting edge stuff gets edged out then by the sheer quantity of derivative research work. How do you decide? It is, it's fascinating. I mean, it raises all sorts of questions. It raises all sorts of questions about what right do you have to exclude somebody's research work.
Precisely. Yeah. Well, I think if you feel that there are 2 types of publications, high quality and low quality, in other words, it would also be interesting to, from my perspective, you may disagree with me, but from my perspective, it's really interesting to find out whether you can identify 2 separate clusters. Maybe there are 2 separate clusters. So who knows? That's
an interesting idea. Yes.
Yeah, or maybe there are 3 clusters, and each cluster is characterized by some features. You know, I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's how I would look at it. I mean,
yes.
because I'm coming from a quantitative background, so I like to let the data speak for itself rather than I impose my thoughts, because personally I find that most often I'm quite wrong when when it comes to having ideas about data. So when you let the data speak for itself, sometimes some patterns emerge that we wouldn't otherwise be aware of it, and this interesting discoveries can be made under those circumstances.
Yes, yes. I'll send you a couple of my vocabulary papers, and you can pull them to bits for me.
All right, so thank you very much for the questions, and if you don't have any further questions or anything, yeah. All right. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.